Welcome back to the Crowdstorm class, and this is going to be part 2 of 3, where we are learning how to get really big ideas from very big crowds. So just as a brief recap, last week, or in the last session, we looked at some context for crowdstorming, and then we looked at the brief and explored some incentives and ultimately got to the introduction to the search pattern. And then we talked a little bit about the class project again. We just looked at the brief, and the focus was submitting your first idea. And so today, we're going to take things a little bit further, and we're going to introduce a new pattern, a little bit more complicated pattern called the collaboration pattern. We're going to talk about community as opposed to crowds. And we're also going to address recruiting, and I think there were some questions about that, so hopefully we'll address those. And then on the project, we're going to get into less of a focus on submissions of your ideas and more onto how to give feedback to others, and then obviously interpreting, and hopefully there's useful feedback that you can use in your own updates. So let's get started. So recruiting, really, once you've sorted out the brief and you understand your incentives, your crowdstorm is really only as good as the participants, right? So what do we mean? Well, when we think about recruiting, we can think about it in terms of a journey, and there's a similar idea in marketing in terms of thinking about a journey to purchase a product or a service, and I think this works very similarly from what we've seen. So first off, you've got to think about an awareness problem, right? So you have a target group of people that you'd like to participate, and it may be lots of different target groups, but you've got to figure out, where do you find those people? How are they going to become aware of what you're doing? So you're going to need content. You're going to need something for them to interact with. It could be someone. It could be press coverage of your idea. It could be video. Really, any content that you think is appropriate to get the message out about the problem that you're solving. And then the question is, where is that content going to go, right? And that is the beginning of the journey, is simply becoming aware of the challenge or the crowdstorm that you are setting up. And once you've solved the awareness problem, really you want to make sure that people are going to seriously consider what you proposed, right? So you have a brief and you have incentives, and between those two things, people are going to move from awareness to consideration. So things that they might use in their consideration, they might look at, do you have a history of working with crowdstorming, and can they find any examples of successes, right? Where a success might be that you paid people out, right? Or a success might be that there's press coverage and the crowdstorm was seen to be very successful. Or consideration might simply be that they know your brand or they know your partners, right? Again, looking back to the coalition from the first session, this is one of the reasons that coalitions can be very important, is during the consideration phase, if you have a good partner, like a good media partner or a partner from a well-known brand, if you're a startup, that could be helpful. That all helps consideration. And then finally, people are going to evaluate the merits, right? What do they think their chances are of getting something from the crowdstorm, right? If they're very focused on the financial rewards, they're going to look at their odds of being able to win. If they are more focused on the experience, they might join in just to see how it goes and learn something. But once you get through evaluation, there's a point at which people decide whether or not they actually want to participate. And in the search pattern that we discussed in the previous session, there really is only one way to participate, right? It is, you're going to respond with an idea. But as we're about to find out, there's actually a lot of other roles. So submitting an idea is the most expensive from a time and effort perspective for any participant. But there are lighter and simpler ways for them to participate, like voting or commenting, which can be very, very helpful, as we're going to discuss in a moment. And then often it's easy to forget that people are going to work with you for some period of time. And like an employee, during that time, they're going to form an opinion and talk about their experience, right? And so whatever their experience might be, whether they might find that, for example, the process didn't seem fair or transparent in terms of picking the best ideas. They might find that the feedback was very useful and they enjoyed the interaction and it was respectful and they learned something, so they might share that. And the important part about that is that ultimately these participants then become part of the awareness cycle, so taking us back to the beginning, because they advocate, right? So hopefully you have some percentage of people who enjoy the process and enjoy working with you on your Crowdstorm enough that they would advocate for others to join in. And then you go back through the awareness. Now, obviously, once you have a strong advocate, moving from becoming aware to considering, right, if it's coming from your friend, to evaluating and ultimately joining, that cycle can happen faster. Anyway, so that's how we think about recruiting, is these different phases of the journey. And in order to effectively recruit, you really need to focus on each one and think about, how you're going to generate the awareness, how do you get people to seriously consider, and then once they do participate, making sure that that experience is good so that they tell others. Okay, so the other way to think about recruiting, and I have this reference on Skillshare for you, is there's lots of different ways to approach it. So this is an example from a DARPA challenge that was run called the Red Balloon Challenge. And this is from a combination of the teams and their final report. And what it lays out is different strategies for recruiting and the results, right? Or at least some elements of recruiting. So if you think about awareness in this case, a lot of these teams started from a similar point in that DARPA was getting press coverage and announced the contest. So there was a baseline awareness. But then it was very clear that the brands were being helped. For example, a lot of people recognized MIT, right? So MIT credited their brand as being able to recruit for their team. Now, that's not to just Georgia Tech. I don't want to get in trouble over that, but Georgia Tech experienced a similar bounce, but probably less so than MIT. At least this was part of the report analysis. Then the gentleman who came in third is actually quite well known within a very specific group of people because he jailbroke the iPhone. So maybe not the brand that MIT is, but certainly within a group of people, he's very popular. If you have a jailbroken iPhone, I don't necessarily want to know, but you might appreciate that the first guy to do that, this is him. And then finally, there was a group of people from geocaching.com. So again, that may be known to a much more specific group of people versus MIT or Georgia Tech. But again, you've got 4 different brands, and that had a lot to do with initial awareness. So again, as we think about things like coalitions, you think about having brands or a group of brands that can help you, they really can be helpful in awareness, right? So that's, I guess, the first point of this is simply to show the brands side by side, and that affected their ability to recruit. So they were competing against each other. If you look at motivation, they all netted out on sort of pretty similar mix of incentives, right? So going back to the first session where we talked about motivation, they all had some sort of financial reward. They all encourage people around the angle of, hey, this is good for science, it's good for research, we'll learn something if we do this together. So we're doing something good and something meaningful in the sense of this is something that you could learn from, that is a good use of your time, because at the end of this we'll learn something new about the internet. So these are similar approaches there. So we can maybe move the motivation aspect a little bit out of this and say that was less important. And then what's really interesting, I think, just to make a point about recruiting and how you can think about a coalition is whether or not there was a existing network, right? So if you look at the last line in this table, you'll see that the first 2 places didn't really have an existing network, right? At least not a well-defined one, right? So they went through their existing social network and recruited people through that, but also benefited from inbound interest generated through PR, right? So MIT was in CNN, I think, as was Georgia Tech, I think also in something like the New York Times. And so they were able to very quickly build a network, right? And then they were competing against existing networks. And what I mean by an existing network is, 50,000 Twitter followers, for example, or 80,000 people who are registered on geocaching.com, right? And so the point here is you can opt to have a partner who has an existing network. You may have your own network, right? If you have a Facebook page, for example, you certainly have a baseline network. If you have Twitter followers, you have a baseline network. But you can partner to get those additional networks, right? So geocaching, effectively, if you were MIT, maybe you would have considered that geocaching would have been a strong partner. Anyway, main point here is very different strategies, but important to think about the value of things like brand in your coalition, how you want to build a network if you want to build one or use an existing one. And I think those are the main points. So you can read more about the DARPA Network Challenge on the Skillshare link. So moving on. So we introduced this idea of the search pattern, and as I touched on in the participation, the participant slide, in thinking about the participant journey, submitting an idea is not the only way to participate. And that's a very important thing to bear in mind. And I'm about to show you why that is. And so if you think about the search pattern, what we talked about is I have really a group or one person that is receiving ideas. And that's the whole process, right? Yes, you have a brief and you have motivation, you have recruiting, and those things are complex and you need to get them right. However, I do have other roles that can be tremendously helpful in the process. So for example, I might have a lot of people that I would like to participate who just don't have enough time, right? The incentive is not sufficient for them to spend 100 hours working with me. But they might have an hour, or they might have 2 hours. And so if I can find a way to tap into their capability or their knowledge or their passion for a subject, I can try and direct that into activities like voting or commenting, right? And that feedback can be very useful. And so that's why we calling this the collaboration pattern. There's far more interaction. It's not just about ideas, but it's about proposing ideas and receiving feedback, either in sort of qualitative, written feedback or commentary, or more quantitative ratings and voting. So a great example of this, I think probably one of the best that I've seen in terms of describing how this works or how to think about a collaboration mode is from Quirky. And if you go to their site, you can find this diagram. But what this diagram is highlighting is really different roles beyond idea submission, right? So at the beginning of the flow, yes, you see idea submission, but then you see an important step called community curation. And community curation is another way of saying a voting and commenting process, right? A feedback process. Now, what that lets Quirky do is then in the product evaluation step, they get to look at the ideas, but they also get to look at the feedback from people who may or may not have submitted ideas. So the likelihood is that for every person who submitted an idea, there may be 10 times that number who are commenting and offering feedback. And between the initial idea and the feedback, Quirky now has a lot more to go on, right? And that's part of what makes the collaboration phase helpful, is you get not just the idea, but the reflections on the idea. And if you follow this diagram around, wherever you see the light blue, you'll notice that this is Quirky's community taking on different roles, right? And offering them feedback, right? Or if you see the pink, it's where they're working together. So during the research phase, again, it's not about submitting ideas. It's about offering feedback to Quirky so that they can make better judgments about how to design, right? How to brand, how to name, etc. All right, so that's the important part about the collaboration pattern is we're no longer just talking about a role of submitting ideas. And if we think back to the very first module when we talked about brainstorming, this was really a core part of the initial brainstorm idea, right? it was not just about submitting ideas, but also about reviewing those ideas and evaluating them. And again, this is what makes the collaboration model interesting and quite powerful. So now we find ourselves in a situation where we have a bunch of people working together, offering feedback, and what we'd like to do with those people is organize them in some ways, right? So where are we going to look to? We need some sort of framework. So there are a lot of what I would say are community management frameworks, but I think it's worth just pausing a little bit to think about communities and people organizing themselves. There's lots of ways to do this. It's existed for a long time, and so I really like the work from Elinor Ostrom, and she ultimately won a Nobel Prize in economics, and a lot of what she focused on was trying to understand really complex interactions between groups of people and how they organize themselves, right? So again, search is fairly simple. I have someone who's organizing the Crowdstorm asking for a group of people to send them ideas. There's not a lot of complexity. But as soon as I say to people, you can't just submit ideas, but you can also offer feedback, I now have a lot more back and forth activity between a much larger group of people. Again, for every person who submits an idea, I can expect 10 times that number or more to give feedback about ideas. So I very quickly go from, let's say, if I had 100 ideas, I'm now talking about potentially 1,000 people interacting. So you can see how this becomes large and complex quite quickly. And so what Elinor Ostrom found, and she actually was not looking at systems in the way that we're looking at crowdstorming, but she was looking at places where people had to figure out how to share resources, right? They had to figure out a system to manage a scarce resource. The scarce resource in our case is not vegetation, it's not fisheries, it's not physical resources, but it's more time and knowledge, right? Everyone has a finite amount of time and knowledge, and what we're trying to do is make sure that everyone gets the most out of it. Make sure that in the exchange of people investing the time and participating in the process, they're treated fairly, right? And the whole group can be productive. And so the elements needed to do this, and I'm just going to list them quickly because we're gonna get into a lot of these in more detail. Is first and foremost, we need monitoring, right? So we need some way to understand what's going on. When we have 1,000 people, most of us can't imagine what it's like to manage 1,000 people. It's hard enough to manage 10 people. But when you're at that scale, you need some way to understand what everyone's doing, right? Once you understand what they're doing, you're going to start to identify different issues. So, for example, they may need help, they may need support, they may have questions, right? Once you have monitoring, you can listen for those things and you can see those things and respond to them. Others may want to change something about how your process is working. They may feel that their idea has been ripped off. They may feel that they're not getting good feedback, right? And so you need to be able to advocate for them within the community, right? Still others may feel that they haven't been properly rewarded, right? So they're not getting a fair value exchange. So they may be have contributed an idea and the idea is not used and they felt it should have been. That could happen. A more sort of subtle example is that they routinely comment and offer feedback, but no one ever thanks them. And this may seem trivial, but again, the point is that the point of monitoring and the point of being able to manage all these complex interactions with 1,000 people or so is we want to make sure that the exchange is fair. And then we're always going to expect bad behavior, right? It's inevitable that there will be some spoilers, unfortunately. And so we need some way to punish or sanction the behavior that is not okay, right? So for example, if someone has stolen someone else's idea, right, we have a system to deal with that, or we need some way to respond to that. If someone is being abusive in commenting, right, which can happen, unfortunately, we need some way to deal with that. Collective choice becomes not always just voting, but basically letting people know that they do have a way to influence the system. If I'm going to invest the time to share an idea, or I'm going to invest the time to offer feedback, I need some way to help to direct the community if I'm planning to stay involved, right? I want some way to be represented, not just maybe through advocacy, but directly through some sort of collective decision making. And then the last 2 points are, have to do with people understanding that they belong to something, that they are members of the community. There's some way of signaling that they're part of that, and we'll revisit that later. And then finally, nesting is more structural question, right? So as you think about each individual idea, you have this idea of monitoring an individual idea and all the responses to those ideas and the behavior and making sure that people get fair value exchange. But then you've got 100 ideas, right, on a specific crowdstorm, and then you start to think about, well, if I have multiple crowdstorms, I now have not just one idea, not just 100 ideas in a crowdstorm, but then maybe 100 crowdstorms. So nesting is this concept of structurally, I want to be able to manage this at the idea level, at the crowdstorm level, and then at multiple crowdstorms as well. All right, so we need people, or we need an organization who's going to take on all of those tasks, right? The monitoring and the support and making sure that someone's advocating. And so I really like the work that Get Satisfaction does. Get Satisfaction is a support and help desk community, and they talk about their community managers as sort of this multifaceted role. And some of this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but it gets to the point of this is a difficult and often tricky and overlooked role of trying to manage thousands of people, right? In the case of Get Satisfaction, it's significantly larger than that, and so again, they're using nesting to break it down. But you can see the roles here, right? So they've sort of broken it down into morning, afternoon, and evening. The therapy thing is kind of a joke, but it's also important. Very often, people may feel that they haven't had a good experience. Something wasn't fair. Someone they submitted an idea and no one commented on their idea, or they got unnecessary, what they thought were harsh comments, right? And talking that through and making them understand that it's part of a process and making them feel better, or if there is a problem, actually acting in a way to help them resolve the issue may put you into the detective role, right? And so you can go on and you can see more of these things. It's equally important often to cheerlead, right? So cheerlead can mean a lot of things, but often during a process of getting feedback and trying to respond to the feedback and trying to update, people are putting in a lot of effort, and sometimes they just need to be cheered on. They need to be reminded about why they are doing this in the first place and that they are valued. Long before anyone's going to make any money, long before people are going to receive rewards, the community manager role is to let them know that things are progressing. The analyst role, again, the analyst is often taking on the role of monitoring, right? So a lot of the monitoring comes back in the form of data which needs to be interpreted. Again, trying to understand the behavior of, let's say, a group of 1,000 people requires some analysis. There's no way around that, and we'll find out why in a little while. And then the diplomat and author, I think the diplomat is again it's a role that evolves in any situation where you've got large groups of people with different expectations and different interests and trying to balance those things. The person running the crowdstorm is trying to get something done. The people participating may be there for any number of reasons, some for money, some for education, and so inevitably you're going to have to reconcile things. And then finally, the author. And the author role, everything that we're talking about in all these interactions, at some point there's a communication problem that needs to be solved. At some point, it may be as simple as joining into a comment thread. It may be that you have to take a position for one group who feel that another part of the group is misbehaving and address that in video. You may appeal to people through video. So the authorship and sort of content production side of this can't be underestimated. It really is critical to making the community management role work. And so just to give credit to Get Satisfaction, really like the way they've laid this out, and they obviously have a particular perspective, in terms of reducing support costs, increasing acquisition, driving product innovation. Again, we have a very specific view on this, which is enabling the collaboration pattern within crowdstorming. So that often fits within the product innovation idea here. All right, so we talked about monitoring, and another way to think about monitoring is the reason that monitoring exists is very broad, right? You want to understand when people need help so you can support them. You want to understand when you might need to advocate for them. And we're going to hone in on a specific issue around understanding contributions, right? And so understanding contributions is at the heart of knowing, what everyone is doing, right? And you take this for granted when you have small teams because you can see the work output and you can interact with people and chat with them and get sort of a sense and then do formal reviews to get this. But at 1,000 people, you're not going to go through formal reviews, so we need another way to solve this, right? So, unfortunately, for those of you who followed news about Aaron Schwartz, I really didn't connect the dots when I heard about his passing. And then I realized that the work that he had done in 2006 actually was critical in shaping a bunch of the thinking around this subject for me. So I'm grateful and sad about the outcome, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But the important work that Aaron did, at least from our perspective, is he challenged a widely held assumption about how Wikipedia worked. Right, so we're going to look at Wikipedia just because it is a great example of collaborative interaction. It's maybe not a crowdstorm in the sense of what we care about, but there are a lot of important lessons for us to learn. And so the assumption was that insiders, or a very small group of, let's say, 500 people, were responsible for most of the edits. What's realized was that actually there were a lot of outsiders. So there was a much larger group. Instead of 500 people, tens or hundreds of thousands of people who were providing most of the content. And the way that he got to this was he took a different view of what he considered work, right? And so there's a lot more detail on this again on Skillshare, but in simple terms, what had happened was people were analyzing who was editing Wikipedia. So an edit could be anything, right? It could be a spelling mistake, it could be deleting a word, a grammatical correction. Every single one of those things would count as an edit. And what Aaron was interested in is trying to understand if I'm going to contribute a whole paragraph of content, and that only counts as one edit, there's a problem. Because I can't count the addition of a paragraph in the same way that I count a grammatical correction. And the reason this is important is it raises this issue of if I'm trying to monitor what people are doing and understand contributions, and I count incorrectly, it leads to a number of downstream problems. If I really believe that Wikipedia is managed by 500 people, then I'm going to go and talk to those 500 people to determine what to do next. But if it turns out that there's actually 100,000 people, I'm now ignoring people who are generating an enormous amount of value. And so I'm actually not able to manage effectively. It would be the equivalent of you ignoring 9 out of 10 people that work with you because you feel that you've heard that one person is doing all the work, when in fact all 10 people are making the contribution. So as we think about how we want to evaluate what people are contributing, we can start to look a little bit closer at communities and what they actually measure, right? So if we take something like a clout score, we can argue that this is inferred from whatever public information is available about us online, and it's assembled into an idea or an index called influence, right? And so you can't really see everything that goes into it, but you can kind of figure out that it has to do with the number of Twitter followers that you have and how they respond to you, how many they respond, who are the people who are responding, and then you can look at that across a number of social channels and eventually build this picture of what's your contribution, right? It's a way of looking at what do you do and how do people respond to you. It's one way of thinking about contributions. right? It's a fairly complex way, but it's one way to think about it. On the lower left, we can look at something like karma from your voto, right? And on your voto, karma is broken out, quite explicit about. You get karma from three things: either the ideas that you submit, the ratings that you provide on other people's ideas, and the comments that you provide. Now, it's not a straight volume calculation. It doesn't mean that more comments equal more karma. People have to react to your comments in some way. So if someone likes your comment, that counts. In the ratings equation, again, it's not just that you rate a lot, but there's some evaluation of how you rate. So if you seem to be wild in relation to everyone else, so your behavior is sort of unpredictable, it counts less towards karma than if, for example, you rate closer to what the overall ratings tend to be. And so those are some of the ways in which you can start to understand, well, what's the quality of this person as a rater, or how good are their comments, how valuable are their comments, right? And then the ideas obviously are a little bit easier because you can figure out, is someone buying the ideas, right? How do the ideas rate against other ideas? And so you can start to provide a score based on the ideas. But the ideas are relatively easier because, again, for every idea that I receive, I may receive 10 or more comments and votes. And so the scale of the comment and rating problem becomes much larger. And then on the right is actually, again, we talk about Quirky, and Quirky has a bunch more metrics that they can look at. They can look at, because they share revenue with people once they put their ideas into production, they can look at people from the perspective of how much money they're earning, right? They can also look at how active they are across the communities, so they can say, what are you influencing, right? And so what's less clear from this list of figures is there's this idea called influence, and influence is what Quirky is most interested in, right? So they want the idea, and the idea counts for a bunch of influence, but they also want the feedback. And so you can earn feedback, or you can earn influence by participating in research or by helping to refine an idea. So similar to your voto, within influence are buried these different concepts of ratings and offering comments and refinements, and then being rewarded for those, so ultimately you can earn money. But again, the important thing here is, if you think back to the Wikipedia example of saying 500 people create Wikipedia, and then discovering that in fact it's 100,000 people because we've been measuring contributions in the wrong way. You can see how important it is, if you're going to build a community and sustain a community, and if you hope to get quality feedback, that you actually measure that correctly. And ultimately, when you look at Quirky, you can see that measurement translates directly into a reward, in a financial reward, right, and recognition. And so you can close the loop on, I've brought people in to participate, I can understand what they're doing, and I can reward them for it. If I can't understand, I can't reward. And if I can't reward, I can't hope that people will stay on long term and actually help me. And so these things are very closely related. All right, so that's the theory for the day. And so let's get back to our problem at hand, and let's solve traffic congestion. And so what I'm going to ask you to think about at this point is, in the first module, we focused on your idea and your response to the brief. And I think now I'd like you to focus on feedback and how you're going to respond to that feedback. So we're not going to be too worried for the moment on how we're going to analyze different people's behavior. We will talk about that at the end. But for your particular role at this point is, think about how you're going to go through the process of offering feedback, and then please do provide the feedback so we can reflect on that and talk a little bit about how that works. And so until next time, goodbye, and we'll be back with the third part soon. Thanks.